All right, class. Today we'll talk about Fisher effect. So basically, we'll talk about international Fisher effect. So before jumping on to international Fisher effect, let's go over a little bit about Fisher effect on. So when you say Fisher effect, it's all about trying to explain nominal interest rate. So let's say whenever we see any interest rate, maybe for our deposits, maybe for our investments, maybe for anything, that is a nominal interest rate. For example, if you want to put money in savings account or money market account in your bank and they're offering you, let's say 0.5%, 1%, 3%, these are basically nominal interest rate. And Fisher is the guy who actually explains the components of nominal interest rate. So, and that's why it is popularly known as Fisher effect. So when you talk about nominal interest rate, it basically has two components. Expected inflation and real interest rate. When we talk about inflation, it means persistent increase in the price level. So you have to be careful. Inflation means persistent increase in the price level. If you compare the gas price before COVID and right now, you can see that before COVID, the gas price was below $2. Right now, the gas price is around $3. So there's a persistent increase over the time. This is called inflation. Now, when you talk about real interest rate means any return you generated from your investments when the inflation rate in the economy is zero. You can also think about real interest rate as a kind of rate that is giving you for compensating for delaying your consumption. Let's say you have $100 today. You can use this $100 for your consumption, buy some foods, buy some stuffs for you, or you can put this $100 into a bank account or an investment account, generate some return. So if you put the money in an account and delay your consumption, you need some compensation. So real interest rate is kind of giving you the compensation for delaying your consumption. And that compensation is basically a kind of rate of return you're generating when the inflation is zero. If we sum these two up, nominal interest rate is basically a function of expected inflation over the investment period, and also the real rate of return you should be getting from the investments. So this is basically Fisher effect. Fisher actually trying to explain nominal interest rate, what you see in our day-to-day investment cases is a function of two components, expected inflation and real interest rate. Now we learn this Fisher effect in terms of international context. And now we move on to international Fisher effect. So let's say we have two countries. Okay. We have two countries, USA and UK. And we know that both of these countries pay money on your investment, on your deposit, right? So that means all these rates are nominal interest rate. So for both of these countries, nominal interest rate is a function of two factors, expected inflation and real interest rate. Now, as you already explained, real interest rate is a kind of interest rate when inflation is zero, or you can think of it as a kind of compensation for dealing with consumption. So it is a very realistic assumptions we can think of for any country. Real interest rate should be same. So if US and UK for investors, if both real interest rate is same thing, same amount, then we can say that any difference in the nominal interest rate between these two countries is a function of difference in expected inflation rate between these two countries. So if real interest rate is same, constant, we can take this out from both of the equations. And then if we compare the differences in nominal interest rate between USA and UK, that differential is a function of differential in the expected inflation rate. Now, let's look at an example. Let's say the nominal rate of USA is 5% and nominal rate of UK is 3%. So here I'm denoting nominal interest rate as NR, nominal rate. And we also assume that the real interest rate is same for the two countries, which is 2%. In that case, inflation in USA is 3%, inflation in UK is 1%, right? Inflation in US is 3%, inflation in UK is 1%, and the difference is 2%, right? 3 minus 1, 2%, which is also calculable or estimable from the difference in the nominal rate between these two countries. If you look carefully, the difference in nominal rate from these two countries is 2%. Which is coming from the difference is the expected inflation. So according to international fishery fact, the difference in nominal interest rate of two countries is a function of the difference in the expected inflation from these two countries. Now going back to the slide, we know what is fishery fact, and we also know what is international fishery fact, and we also know what are some differences here. Now, one of the key things you have to be careful. In the economy, it is assumed that real interest rate should be positive. Real interest rate should be positive. It could be 0.1, 0.2, very, very little amount, but it should be positive because you should always be compensated for dealing with consumption. In that case, if expected inflation is positive, nominal interest rate is a function of positive real rate plus the expected inflation. And now we are deriving, and we already showed that expected inflation differential is basically a function of nominal interest rate differential of these two countries. Let's say country A and B. Now this is basically the assumptions of international fishery fact. Now we'll move on to examine what should be the impact of these assumptions of that outcome on the exchange rate. Now, in the last class, we learned that purchase power parity, PPP. So what was the learnings from purchase power parity? So pause the video here and try to recall what you learned from the last class, purchase power parity. So the learning from the purchase power parity is like, if the inflation rate between these two countries, between any two countries is different, exchange rate should be adjusted accordingly so that same goods in different countries or cost similar. So it's comparable. So if we allow this learning, international fishery fact, change in nominal interest rate is a function of expected inflation rate, right? Difference in nominal interest rate is a function of difference in inflation rate. So if we know this learning from purchase power parity, we know that if you can see interest rate is high in some country, that means inflation rate should be high in that country too. If this is true, exchange rate should be adjusted accordingly, which means in this hypothetical case, exchange rate for the home country should depreciate. So that going forward, there is no arbitrage profit. Now the implication for international fishery fact. We already learned that international fishery fact theory suggests that currencies having high interest rate should have high expected inflation, and that will cause the currencies to depreciate because of purchase power parity, so that going forward, investors cannot earn or generate higher return from investing outside or in the home country. So that's basically the implications of international fishery effect. Now let's look at an example. It should be clear. So if we move on here, going back to this example, if you look carefully, it looks like interest rate is high on USA, right? So if we are from UK, what you can do? We can go to US, invest there, and generate more return. However, interest rate is high, that means inflation should be high too in US. So currency rate should depreciate, US currency should depreciate, so that being an investors, we should not be able to generate this 2% interest differential. This is also true if I flip the story. So if I say US interest rate is 5%, but UK rate is 7%, being in people in US, being a resident in US, if I have money, I should not be able to generate these differentials by investing in UK because of UK spot rate or UK currency rate should be depreciated. That's the implication. That's the implication for both home investors, local investors, also the foreign investors in both ways. Now, moving on. This is the implications for both. Now, implications for international future effect of two non-US currencies. So the idea is, if I change the example in the two cross currency setting, let's say we are in US, we are comparing Canada and Japan. Now let's say nominal rate in Canada is, let's say, 6%, nominal rate in Japan is basically, let's say, 2%. Now think from these two country people, investors. People from Japan may want to invest their savings in Canada so that they can generate 6%. But the implication from international future effect, inflation should be more in Canada, right? If we again assume the real rate for these two countries are 2%, that means inflation in Canada is 4%, inflation in Japan is 0%, right? If this is true, what is the implication? Currency in Canada should depreciate so that people from Japan cannot invest in Canada and generate return. So the implication for international future is very similar. High interest rate is coming from high inflation. High inflation should affect the currency value according to purchase power parity. Currency value should be adjusted accordingly so that it will be impossible to generate high return by investing in other countries. Now, so far, what do we assume? So far, we assume that 2% real interest rate, right? So we could have assumed different interest rate, maybe 1%, 3%. Going back to this example, if we assume interest rate is 1%, you can see that inflation value is different, right? However, the differential stays the same. Differential stays the same. So the assumption is, as long as we are assuming that real interest rate is same for two different countries, doesn't matter. Differentials in the interest rate is coming from differentials in the inflation, it doesn't matter. It should not affect the results in terms of qualitatively and quantitatively. But the problem arises if we think the real interest rate is different in USA versus real interest rate is different in UK. So there is a problem. That's a limitation of international future effect. But we can assume different real rate, but as long as we're assuming same rate for both countries, there is no problem. Now, imperfect offsetting, what does it mean? So far what we assumed in the currency value should be adjusted based on inflation differentials, right? Should be adjusted exactly based on inflation differentials. But we know that from the purchase power parity theory, inflation is not the only factor that affect the currency value or currency rates. There are so many other things. It could be national income level, it could be um, government controls, it could be so many other things, right, that affect the currency value. So as a result, sometimes the currency changes may be more or maybe less than the inflation differentials, sorry, nominal interest rate differentials. In those cases, being an investor, you may be able to earn more or less because of changes in currency value. And we know that inflation or interest rate is not the only factor that is affecting changes in currency value. So that is basically imperfect offsetting effect. Now, if you are a believer of international fiscal effect, you should always prefer investing money in home country, because you know that even if the foreign country is giving a higher rate, because of international fiscal effect, currency value will be adjusted accordingly, so that you should not be able to generate more profit. On the other hand, if you are not a believer of international fiscal effect, you are only looking at the interest rate differentials, you may be preferring investing in foreign countries because interest rate is higher there, but end of the day, over the time, currency could adjust more or less in an imperfect way, so that it could have different effect. So that's the implication of imperfect offsetting effect. So now, some examples here. If we look at this table, you can see that right now, interest rate discount is 13%, interest rate 8%, Japan 5%. We just hypothetically assume that real interest rate is 2% for all these three countries. If this is true, and look at here, nominal interest rate differentials of foreign savings versus home savings, a foreign deposit versus home deposit. So if a US investor is putting money in Canada, it should have around 30%, whereas if a US investor is putting money in US, it should have an 8%. So the interest rate differential is 8%. And look at the inflation, expected inflation differentials between foreign country and home country. So if you look at the expected interest rate differentials, inflation in Canada is 11%, 13 minus 2. Inflation in US is 6%, 8 minus 2. So inflation differentials is 5%, right? If IFE hold, international fiscal effect hold, what is the implications? Expected exchange rate movement, right? Canada currency will depreciate by 5%. So what is the return? Expected return on foreign savings deposit 8%, because if you put money in Canada, you should generate 13%, but due to currency changes, 5% drop, you're generating 8%. So that means you're generating 8% by putting money in home currency. So if you are a believer of, again, if you're a believer of IFE, it's better to invest money in home country, because if IFE hold, currency value will be adjusted so that you should not be able to generate more money. And if you just look through these two examples again, so you're actually able to generate the same amount of return by investing in home country. Now, derivations. Similar equation, derivation. Exchange rate is a function of interest rate of home country divided by interest rate of foreign country. Derivation. And we know that if we want to generalize, this is the generalized approximation, right? So it's a differentials of home country and foreign country. Now, if you go to the main formula, the real formula, and if you look at the examples, if we assume that 1 year deposit rate in home country, let's say US is 11%, 1 year deposited in foreign country, let's say UK is 12%. Now, if the actual returns putting money in US versus UK needs to be same, the return generating putting money into these countries need to be same, then how much foreign currency should be changed over the period so that you should not be able to generate more return by putting money in the foreign country. Just plug in the values in the formula, and this is the result. So the foreign currency needs to be depreciated by 0.89% over the horizon so that you should not be able to generate more money by putting money in the foreign country. Now, how things happen? What is the channels that will lead to depreciate or appreciate the currency value? Here are some examples. Let's say in your home country, interest rate is high. What is the implication? Inflation is also high. When inflation is high, what is the impact on the trade? Imports will increase because goods and services in the foreign country is cheaper. Export will decrease because goods and services in the home country is expensive. So that means being in home country, people will demand more foreign currency, and the foreign country people will demand less of home currency. That's why local currency should be depreciated by the inflation differential. As a result, you should not be able to generate more money. This is the flip side. Low interest in the home country, the low inflation. Imports will decrease, exports will increase, right? So that means home currency should appreciate by the inflation differentials. No changes. Interest rate between local and foreign countries is same. Inflation should be same. No impact on the trade. No changes on the currency value. So these are basically the channels on different scenarios. So pause the video and read at your own. We talked about that. Now, graphical presentation. This line is similar to purchase power parity, right? So any point on the IFE line there is no disparity. So the currency value is adjusted. Currency value is adjusted according to the interest rate differentials. On the other hand, anything not in the line, below the line, that means people from the home country can generate some return by investing in the foreign country. I think above the line, that means foreign people, if they make foreign deposits in our home country, should be able to generate some more return than their domestic deposits. So the explanation is here. Points on the IFE line. All the points in the IFE line reflect exchange rate adjustments are perfect to account for differential interest rate. This means investor will end up achieving the same yield whether they invest at home or in foreign country. Doesn't matter. Points below IFE line. Higher returns from investing in foreign deposits. Being in home country, you can generate more return from investing in foreign deposits. Points above IFE line, above, that means returns from foreign deposits for the foreign people are lower than returns possible in domestic. So basically, you can think about from the home country, if you invest in the foreign deposit, you should not be able to generate more. So that's also for, let's see one more slide, limitation. Okay, let's talk about a little bit of the limitations. So far you learned that in the purchase power parity, it doesn't hold always because it's a function of a lot of factors, not about inflation. Similar things here. So there are some limitations. So walk through these limitations. So this is all for today's class. We'll talk about rest of the chapters in the next class. Thank you.